Hello everyone, welcome to today's lesson on Intro to Statistics. So we spent this entire year doing numbers, polynomials, all that kind of stuff. So luckily for y'all, today's lesson there's no numbers involved, it's just a bunch of definitions. Right, but important stuff. Alright, so starting off with statistics, we see statistics everywhere. So things like the SOGs, the shots on goals in hockey, we've got a chance of rain tomorrow, right? And there's, of course, the number of students who enjoy Mr. C's class, which is, all of you. So now, it is important to understand what those definitions actually mean in statistics, right? So whenever we read studies, it's important for us to understand what it is telling us. Right? So for example, if research shows that vaping is not good for your health, I should probably look into the sample of people that was surveyed. Alright, so our first definition is the population. Right? So of course, in outside of statistics, population is just how many people there are. As of right now, Canada has around 40 million. Alright. But when it comes to the definition of population in statistics, right, it is pretty much the things, everything that we consider for our study. So for example, a population could be all the students in SD43. Right? As an example. Right? And now examples are a little different. Right? Examples is a portion of the participants from the population. Right? Because it's not really possible to actually get data from every single person from a population. Right? So most of the times we use samples, which is just a portion of the people in a population. Right? So for example, if the total population is all the students from SD43, then an example could be, say, a portion of the students from SD43. So only the students in Mr. C's class, right? That's an example. Or all the students who have the letter B in SD43. I have no idea what study can do with it, but that's an example. All right. And now, when we get our examples, ideally, we should choose them randomly. Right, I just said students in Mr. C's class is a sample, but it's not really a good sample because it's not really random. We just see Mr. C and say, all right, every single one of you, you're our sample now. Right? They should always be chosen randomly because let's say, for example, if I want to get a survey on the student's favorite teacher in all of SD43, no, if I only survey the people in my class here, then of course everyone will just pick me because I'm their favorite teacher. Right? No, I will not be taking any questions. So it's important to always pick random students, right, out of the whole population. So random students of the entire school or random students in all of SD43. Right? So there's a few ways we can find random examples. Right? Of course, the most convenient one is called just convenient sampling, which is just ask whoever's around. Right? If you see those like cringe TikToks where people go up and just interview random people, yeah, that's pretty much convenient sampling. Just go to whoever they find on the streets and ask them a question. Of course, there's a lot of bias towards that, right? We'll talk a bit more about what bias is, but as of right now, all we need to know is that it's essentially something that we want to avoid. Right? It's almost like a pro and a con, where this is more like the disadvantage. Right? So convenient sampling, yes, it is convenient because we just ask whoever's around. But the downside of that is we only get the opinions of people who we find. All right, next we have the voluntary response sampling. So those are where people choose to be involved. So I could hand out a piece of paper and say, all right, if you want to participate in my super cool study, right, you can be my example. Right? And of course, as you can imagine, it's not really valid or scientific, right? Because at this point, we just rely on whoever wants to participate, not just a complete random sample. Okay, next we got television online surveys. Right? So those are finding examples of people who watch a particular show or website. Right? Or I guess go on a website. Right? And as you can imagine, it can get pretty opinionated. Right? Because for those who only watch, say, I don't know, if someone's watching a survey on their thoughts on office culture, and we only get samples from people who watch The Office, then it will be pretty the data will be pretty skewed on one side, right? So oftentimes we try to not do just television or online surveys, just because if you are if you find a survey through watching a certain television, chances are you have some pretty strong opinions relating to the television station, right? And so because it doesn't reflect the general public. So for random samples, as you can imagine, we want to randomly select individuals. And so every single person in the population has the same chance of being in a sample. So as you can imagine, the larger the sample is, the closer our sample is to the population. Right, so once again, let's take every single student in SD43 here. If we're to randomly select people, say I will blindfold myself and throw darts at the dartboard, and then see whoever gets picked, right? Of course, actually, I guess the person in the middle might have the highest chance of me hitting. Huh. That's a horrible example, but let's say we randomly generate a list of names. Right? That is a good way of randomizing our samples, because everyone has the same chance of being selected. Of course, computer programs are not purely random. Nothing in the universe is purely random. But for now, all we need to know is if you just randomize it, it's fine. Yeah, and the reason why larger samples are more accurate is because if, let's say, you survey 10 people and one person, say, doesn't like cheese, right? It's not as accurate, because then to us, that's, 10% people don't like cheese. And that's not really accurate. But if, let's say, we have 1,000 people or 10,000 people, let's just say 1,000 people, and then 10 people say they don't like cheese. Well, in that case, then that's only 1%. Right? So it really depends on how big the sample size is to get the most accurate reading. Right? Oh yeah, so yeah, again, some examples. You can pick names in a hat. Again, a random page on a phone book, for those of you who are ancient to know what phone books are. Right? And of course, most importantly, and make sure that our data is unbiased. Right? Sampling randomly gets rid of bias. Right? And of course, as you can imagine, bias is one of the most influential things when it comes to sampling. Right? So a bias is when a sample takes items from a wrong population. Right? So for example, if you were to get a sample size of, let's say, what should we study? Let's study whether or not playing Pokemon is good for your health, right? If you only sample people who play Pokemon Go, well, of course you're all gonna say it's good for your health, right? As an example. So that's a good example of bias, right? You have bias towards people who play the game. Right? And those are some important things to consider when we look at studies. Right? A use of language is also very important, right? So it's pretty much just how a question is framed. Well, how a question is phrased is probably a better way to put it. Right? Because the way we ask a question could affect the answer. Right? So for example, if asking were you bullied in school is different than did you have any bad experiences in high school? Right? Because if you ask this question, it's pretty much just yes or no. But if you ask this question, chances are, other than bullying, you might have some other not so good experiences. Right? For example, you might not have the honor to be Mr. C's class, which might be a bad experience for you. Right? So the way we phrase the question is very important. Okay. Next, we have the ethics of data. Right? It's very important we're using data only for our studies, for its intended use. Right? Because if we're to collect everyone's emails for a survey, but then it turns out that we're using those emails to sell advertisements, then of course, as you can see, that's not very nice, isn't it? Right? That's not very ethical. I'm pretty sure that's illegal, right? So the ethics of the study is very important. Right? What are you doing with all this sensitive data? right? Because all this data we gathered must only be used as intended. Right? We cannot use this data for something else. And of course, the cost is also important. Right? This data collecting must be worth the effort, just like most things in life. Right? And most importantly, the provider of the money must have no ties to the study. This is what we call conflict of interest. Right? So, for example, let's say you want to sell 200 tires. Right? But to prove that the tires will last 60,000 kilometers at least, right? You need to test at least 10 tires. And of course, that's something you need to do because, well, you need to test plenty of tires in order to say like, oh, look how nice my tires are. But at the same time, you're losing 10 tires to the testing. You cannot sell them anymore. Right? So all the data has to be worth the effort. And when it comes to conflict of interest, the most common one is on climate change. Right? A lot of studies show that climate change is not, or a very, very minority, probably like 1 or 2% of all studies does show that climate change is not real. And if you look at it closer, most of those climate change denial papers are sponsored by gas companies who, benefit from people not knowing about climate change. Right? So it's something to watch out about on if you see a study, make sure to look at what is sponsoring that said study. Right? And of course we also have to be sensitive about what our studies is it what was I about to say? Wow. We also have to be careful about the cultural values of our study. Because being some cultures can see some studies as disrespectful and disruptive. Right. Because in Canada and also in most parts of the world, we live in a very multicultural society. So we have to be aware of the things we ask people. Right. If you're having a survey on indigenous worldviews and questions, right? Make sure that it is worded very specifically and respectfully, right, for all involved. Right? So again, those are just this part of the page is pretty much telling you things to watch out for if you're to run your own study or if you see someone else's study. But that's pretty much it for today's lesson, right? It's just like a big vocab dump on what statistics are. Right? But starting from next lesson, we'll go back to working with numbers again, which I know you're super excited about. With that being said, good luck practicing.